On the night of June 22, 1941, the German army, with the support of the armies of the Allied states, invaded the territory of the USSR. Having secured a numerical superiority over the Red Army in the main directions of attack, as well as destroying a significant part of Soviet aviation at base airfields and thereby securing air supremacy, the German divisions rapidly advanced deep into the Soviet Union. At the initial stage, everything developed in full accordance with the Barbarossa Plan. German panzer divisions with swift blows broke through the defenses of the Red Army in formed pockets, depriving the Soviet divisions of supplies, and, consequently, the ability to resist. At first glance, German tactics worked the same way as they did in France and Poland, but by early September it became obvious that a mistake had been made in the planning of Operation Barbarossa and the Red Army was putting up much more fierce resistance than expected. The German General Staff understood that it would not be possible to achieve its goals by the scheduled date and the war could become protracted. To remedy the situation, a plan of attack on Moscow was developed, the implementation of which would allow them to seize a key transport hub and force the Soviet leadership to capitulate. At the initial stage of the attack on Moscow, the German divisions were lucky. They managed to break through the defenses of the Red Army and form two pockets in the vicinity of Vyazma and Bryansk. Nevertheless, as they moved towards Moscow, the resistance of the Red Army only intensified. In the end, the Army Group Center, which was advancing on Moscow, ran out of steam, and the Red Army, having received reinforcements, was able to push the enemy back from its capital. However, the Red Army still did not have enough forces, and therefore the attempt to encircle and destroy the main forces of the Army Group Center in the vicinity of Rzhev was unsuccessful. In turn, the German command, realizing that the Blitzkrieg plan had completely failed, began preparations for a long confrontation. According to the plans drawn up, the German divisions were to establish control over Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, and also, having captured Stalingrad, block communication between the central regions of the USSR and the Caucasian region. While the German General Staff was developing plans for further military operations, the Soviet command also did not waste time. Inspired by the victory near Moscow in the spring of 1942, the Soviet Army launched a counteroffensive planning to encircle and destroy enemy divisions in the vicinity of Kharkov. During the counteroffensive, the Soviet command decided to use the German tactics of deep breakthroughs by forming tank corps for these purposes, which were analogous to German panzer divisions. The problem was that due to the shortage of T-34 tanks, these corps consisted mainly of T-70 and BT-7 light tanks. At the initial stage, the counter-offensive of the Red Army was quite successful, but in May 1942, the Wehrmacht divisions managed to cut off from the main forces and surround the detachments of the Red Army advancing on Kharkov. As a result of the failure of the attack on Kharkov, the Red Army suffered huge losses in killed and prisoners. After the defeat of the Red Army near Kharkov, the Wehrmacht turned to active operations, launching a simultaneous offensive in the North Caucasus and the Volga, planning to capture Stalingrad. In turn, the Red Army tried to organize a defense, but experienced a serious shortage of forces after the defeat near Kharkov. On June 28, 1942, having broken through the defenses of the Bryansk and southwestern fronts, the German divisions launched an attack on Voronezh. In turn, the detachments of the Red Army, fearing the encirclement, began to hastily retreat in order to preserve the available forces. Thus, already on July 6, the German army formed the Don and established control over most of Voronezh. Having continued the offensive already on July 24, the Wehrmacht divisions entered Rostov-on-Don, and by July 27 they completely suppressed the resistance of the Red Army in the city. Meanwhile, the command of the Red Army, having guessed the enemy's plan, began to hastily prepare for the defense of Stalingrad. For the attack on Stalingrad, the German command concentrated 430,000 soldiers, 250 tanks, and 1,200 aircraft, while the Red Army had 386,000 soldiers, 230 tanks, and 714 aircraft at the disposal of the Red Army in this sector of the front. The battle for Stalingrad began on July 17, when the advancing divisions of the Wehrmacht collided with the forward detachments of the Red Army at the turn of the Chur and Simla rivers. The Red Army put up stubborn resistance, which is why the German command had to use additional forces to fight the advanced detachments of the Red Army. Only 5 days later, the Germans managed to push the forward detachments of the Red Army from their positions. The northern and southern groups of the Wehrmacht launched an offensive on July 23 and 25. Thanks to air superiority and numerical superiority in the main directions of strikes, the Wehrmacht managed to break through the defenses of the Red Army on the right flank and on July 24 reached the banks of the Don region from the village of Golubinskaya. The stubborn resistance of the Red Army forced the German command to hastily transfer the 4th Panzer Army of Hoth, which was advancing into the Caucasus, to the Stalingrad direction. On August 2, 1942, the Army of Hoth advancing from the south reached the vicinity of Kotelnikov and thereby created a direct threat of a breakthrough to Stalingrad. By August 9, the Wehrmacht managed to push the Red Army across the Don River and encircle 4 divisions in the vicinity of the city of Kalach-on-Don. Only on August 14, the encircled divisions of the Red Army managed to escape from the boiler, and the counterattack of the 1st Guards Army under the command of General Moskalenko helped stop the enemy advance. The last detachments of the Red Army that defended Kalach-on-Don left the city on September 1 after receiving an order from the command. Thus, due to the stubborn resistance of the Red Army, the Wehrmacht failed to break into Stalingrad with a swift blow, so the German command had to hastily make changes to their plans. Meanwhile, on August 23, the 16th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht, with the support of aviation, was able to reach the banks of the Volga near the northern outskirts of Stalingrad and occupy Spartanovka. Also on August 23, German aviation carried out a massive bombardment of the city, which caused serious damage to the defensive structures of the Red Army. On September 1, the Wehrmacht began to storm the city, but faced stubborn resistance from the Red Army. Despite this, already on September 13, German detachments managed to break into the city center, and in some places reached the banks of the Volga. Fierce battles were fought in the city for every house and street. On October 14, the Wehrmacht divisions, having pulled up reserves, began a decisive offensive against the Soviet bridgeheads near the Volga. The offensive was carried out with the support of more than 1,000 aircraft, but despite the huge losses on both sides, the Wehrmacht failed to push the Red Army beyond the Volga. Meanwhile, the Red Army was preparing a counteroffensive by pulling additional divisions into the Stalingrad region. The German command also did not sit idly by to continue the assault on the city. It pulled Allied forces in the vicinity of Stalingrad in the person of the Romanian, Hungarian and Italian armies. Before the start of the counteroffensive, the Red Army managed to concentrate 1,100,000 soldiers, 1,463 tanks and 1,350 aircraft in the Stalingrad area. While at the disposal of Germany and its allies were 1 million soldiers, 675 tanks and 1,216 aircraft. On the morning of November 19, the Red Army begins Operation Uranus. The advancing divisions of the Red Army in the very first days broke through the defenses of the 3rd Romanian Army in the north and the 4th Romanian Army in the south. At the initial stage, the German command considered the actions of the Red Army to be local counterattacks, but when it became obvious that the Red Army was conducting a large-scale counteroffensive, it was already too late. The divisions of the Red Army advancing from the south and north managed to close the encirclement around the city of Kalach-on-Don. Once surrounded, the commander of the 6th Army of the Wehrmacht, General Paulus, planned to gather all his forces into a shock fist and try to break out of the encirclement, but received Hitler's order to organize all-round defense and wait until the main forces of the Wehrmacht released his army. In order to come to the aid of the encircled 6th Army, the German command hastily formed the Don Army Group, led by General Feldmarschall Manstein. On December 12, 1942, the Don Army Group launched an offensive. I planned to break through the encirclement and restore contact with the 6th Army. At the initial stage, the Wehrmacht was lucky. Manstein's divisions managed to break through the defenses of the Red Army and continue moving towards the encircled 6th Army. Manstein did not succeed in bringing his plan to life, since his divisions were stopped by the 2nd Guards Army transferred from the reserve under the command of Malinovsky. On December 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Little Saturn. On the northern sector of the front, Soviet divisions broke through the defenses of the Italian and Romanian armies, which could not offer serious resistance, thanks to which the Soviet divisions entered the operational space. On the southern sector of the front, the Red Army also launched a counteroffensive, as a result of which it managed to push back the divisions of the Don Army Group 200 kilometers from Stalingrad. After the completion of Operation Small Saturn, the Soviet command began developing the Koltso plan, the purpose of which was to destroy the encircled 6th Army of the Wehrmacht. On January 9, 1943, Paulus was given an ultimatum to surrender, which he rejected. Already on January 10, the Red Army launched an offensive, gradually squeezing the ring around the encircled 6th Army of the Wehrmacht. By January 26, the Red Army managed to divide the enemy forces into two parts. Caught in a hopeless situation, Paulus, who had received the rank of General Feldmarschall the day before, was forced to capitulate on January 31, 1943. The second part of the German group, commanded by General Strecker, continued to resist, but on February 2 was also forced to capitulate. As a result of Operation Koltso, a huge amount of equipment and weapons, as well as up to 100,000 soldiers and officers, fell into the hands of the Red Army. And the commander of the 6th Army, Friedrich Paulus, became the first German General Feldmarschall in history to surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad was a radical turning point in the war, after which the strategic initiative passed into the hands of the Red Army. The armies of Germany's allies were completely demoralized, which is why the German command was forced to use them only for rear service. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so as not to miss new videos.